welcome to a brand new episode of Beyond the Indus. I'm your host, Tusher Shetty, and I'd like to apologize in advance for the delay in this episode, as well as my voice. I'm currently operating out of Bombay, India, and the transition from minus 5 degrees Celsius in Berlin to 35 degrees Celsius in Mumbai caused me to fall sick immediately. But nonetheless, it's good to be back in India, and a lot of interesting developments happening in and around the region. The Rosina Dialogue, for instance, is just starting up in New Delhi, so we'll get a better understanding of India's foreign policy priorities over the next 4 years in the coming weeks. And we've just witnessed the horrific attack on a train in Pakistan by Baloch separatists, lending a new dimension to the issue of Baloch separatism. That's something that we have covered in previous episodes. And of course, we're witnessing massive geopolitical disruptions following the realignment of US foreign policy in President Trump's second term. But we're not going to be covering any of that this episode, because amid these great games by great powers in the global arena, it is often the most vulnerable populations who are the most deeply affected, and whose suffering is most often overlooked. In these chaotic times, it is these people and their stories that we should endeavor to highlight. And over the next couple of episodes, we here at Beyond the Indus intend to do precisely that. To mark the occasion of International Women's Day 2025, we're happy to announce a 2-episode collaboration with Amnesty International in order to draw attention to the stories of suffering and resilience from some of the most vulnerable populations in South Asia, with a special focus on women. So the focus of this episode is going to be on an ongoing humanitarian catastrophe that the global community is aware of, but seems unable or unwilling to address. And that is the plight of the people, and especially the women of Afghanistan. Since the United States' withdrawal and takeover of the Taliban in 2021, Afghanistan's women have faced a rapid and systemic erasure of all semblance of human dignity, deprived of their right to work, denied even the most basic educational facilities, and even restricted in their movements outside their house. The women of Afghanistan are now living in a state of what many international organizations are describing as gender apartheid. Even those women and men who managed to flee the Taliban are now enduring a precarious existence as refugees, as the withdrawal of US aid and visa programs and a general backlash against refugee acceptance across Western countries has left these populations bereft of resources and options. We'll be speaking later to Dr. Isabelle Lassee, Deputy Director for Research at Amnesty South Asia, to get an understanding of how bad exactly the situation has become for Afghanistan's women and refugee populations, who are now facing mass levels of deportation from Pakistan back to Afghanistan. But first, we'll be speaking to Catherine Putz, Managing Editor at the Diplomat and our in-house expert on Central Asia, to discuss the shifts in US policy towards Afghanistan since 2016. The impact of the aid freeze and visa cancellations, as well as the broader dilemma of engagement versus pressure as a means to secure a better future for the people of Afghanistan. Stay tuned. So joining us today is Catherine Putz. Catherine is Managing Editor of The Diplomat and our in-house expert on all things Central Asia and Afghanistan. Katie writes extensively on politics, security, and culture in the former Soviet space, and also co-hosts our sister podcast, the Asia Geopolitics podcast, along with Ankit Panda. Having formerly worked at the World Bank and the Atlantic Council, she brings a considerable amount of experience in the foreign policy space, and I'm quite keen to discuss with her the recent changes in the Trump administration's policies towards aid, refugees, and Afghanistan in general, and what impacts we might see in the medium to long term because of these policies. So, Katie, it's great to have you on Beyond the Indus, and thank you so much for finally joining the podcast.
It's a pleasure to join you.
Great, Katie. So just to start, could you give our listeners an overview of U.S. policy towards Afghanistan, starting maybe from the post-withdrawal stage, that is the Biden presidency 2021, and post the takeover of the Taliban specifically? How had the U.S. continued to engage officially and unofficially with either Afghanistan or the Taliban regime under the presidency of Joe Biden?
Yeah, certainly. That's a great place to start. So, engagement by the Biden administration with the Taliban really ebbed and flowed following the August 2021 withdrawal and the Taliban's seizure of power. there was a certain pragmatism that really directed relations early on. For example, the U.S. was trying to withdraw its forces and extract its people, and the Taliban wanted them to get out. So there was, in a way, a shared goal and a degree of cooperation toward that shared goal. In the ensuing months, the U.S. continued to provide humanitarian aid. We can get more into that a little bit later, and sort of worked to keep the Afghan economy from entirely collapsing. At the same time, the U.S. And others froze billions in Afghan assets, Afghan central bank assets that were held in the United States. The Biden administration continued to deny the Taliban recognition, and so there were hiccups in this sort of nascent cooperation. And this cooperation, this tentative engagement, was derailed several times and sort of got back on track and would be derailed. For example, when the Taliban's leadership in the spring of 2022 decided to ban girls over a certain age from attending school. That was sort of followed by other oppressive policies that have made that deepening engagement really impossible under the Biden administration. And that's kind of consistently, the Biden administration had consistently stressed this vision of an inclusive Afghan government. And so without any kind of movement toward that inclusive Afghan government, it really limited what official and sort of public diplomacy with the Taliban could be. But at the same time, that sort of unofficial and sort of below the surface engagement was ongoing. In the summer of 2022, for example, so a couple months later, engagement was kind of back on track to a certain extent. We saw Biden's special representative for Afghanistan, a guy named Thomas West. At the time, he met with the Taliban to discuss things like earthquake relief, economic stabilization, terrorism, counter narcotics, and that kicked off a bit of re-engagement. That summer, we saw a drone strike in Kabul that killed the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, at the end of July. And so that was the product of some of that counterterrorism cooperation that was happening, absent this top-level diplomatic engagement. And so I would categorize it as kind of a quiet kind of engagement. It was almost always happening, not without difficulties and not without leaving both sides, frankly, very unsatisfied. And I would say at this point, I really want to note that, in the 3 years following the withdrawal, while U.S. aid and assistance to Afghanistan certainly declined, the U.S. spent almost $21 billion on aid for Afghanistan in those last 3 years. And so a large chunk of that was spent on evacuation and resettlement efforts, but about $3 billion is characterized as humanitarian development aid that was really funneled through UN agencies into life-saving programs, food, health, that kind of thing. And so the United States, even after the withdrawal, was the top aid donor to Afghanistan.
Right. I think it's important to stress the continuity of U.S. policy towards Afghanistan in some senses, rather than mark it as a huge break, because much of the groundwork for the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan was laid during the first Trump presidency. Yet during his 2024 campaign, we heard a lot about him just blaming Biden completely for the failures of withdrawal. I think stressing that point a little more than other presidents may have in the past. So maybe could you highlight, just to give us an understanding of how this continuity towards Afghan policy has stretched over different presidencies. Could you talk about President Trump's policies towards Afghanistan during his first presidency and how they may have contributed to the situation in 2021? We've seen drastic changes, obviously, in U.S. foreign and domestic policy in the first few months of Trump's second presidency. Could you subsequently just outline the changes in both his rhetoric and policy on Afghanistan?
Yeah, certainly. So, I think first it's absolutely necessary and important to state very clearly that the withdrawal plan was Donald Trump's plan. His administration signed a deal with the Taliban on February 29th, 2020, on Leap Day 2020, which sketched out the withdrawal of U.S. troops with a specific time frame. It also included the release of thousands of Taliban prisoners and sort of vague hopes that the Taliban would negotiate in good faith with the Afghan Republic. Arguably, the Taliban did not fulfill all of its ends of this bargain, but the United States ultimately did. The Biden administration delayed the date of the withdrawal. I think it was by 6 months, but it ultimately followed through with what was a Trump plan. Now, U.S. presidents have been overseeing the war in Afghanistan for 20 years at that point, and there had been sort of this back and forth over the idea of how and when to get out of Afghanistan. Obama, for example, very infamously attempted to exact a withdrawal. There was a lot of pushback, particularly from Republicans, who argued that, stating a specific withdrawal date was a disaster in the making. Ultimately, it was a Republican president who stated a specific withdrawal date, and his successor, a Democratic president, carried that withdrawal out. Um, Trump, in regard to Afghanistan, has, as he has with many other issues, some oscillated rather wildly in what he says and what his stated policy preferences are. He actually grew the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan early in his first administration. The Obama administration had drawn down troops to, I think it was under 10,000. I think it was 8,000. And in the first sort of year of the Trump presidency, we saw troop numbers inch back up, sort of at the encouraging of military leaders. And then, Trump really sort of pivoted to an exit at any cost kind of strategy. I think while he has oscillated on his pronouncements about Afghanistan, the idea of getting out of this costly war somewhere else that didn't matter to him was sort of always central, and I think. As you noted on the 2024 campaign trail, Trump used the withdrawal as it was executed under President Biden to really bludgeon the Democrats. First Biden and then Kamala Harris, sort of blaming them for messing this thing up, even though I would say again, it was his plan. He never really explained how he would have executed this withdrawal any differently 6 months earlier had he won the 2020 election, and it had gone to his agreed timeline. It's not clear that it would have gone any better. It was certainly politically expedient to beat the Democrats over the Afghan withdrawal. There's plenty to criticize. There's plenty to legitimately criticize about the withdrawal, about 20 years of war. But again, I think a lot of that blame can be sprinkled pretty evenly across the entire political spectrum in the United States. But I think importantly, his harping on this on the campaign didn't to me signal any genuine interest or care about the fate of Afghanistan or Afghans on the part of Trump. And I think we can see that in the policies that his second administration has put forward and are expected to continue to put forward. Since his inauguration, he said pretty little about Afghanistan while enacting policies, particularly the aid freeze, the dismantlement of U.S. aid, the freeze on admitting refugees and other immigration measures, which really directly harm Afghans, both Afghans currently in the United States and Afghans who are in some part of the process to get to the United States. And this certainly affects Afghans who are at risk because they made a bet working with the United States at some point in the last 20 years. The last thing I do want to note here is that at a rally immediately prior to his inauguration, I think it was the day before, Trump threatened to cut financial assistance to Afghanistan if the Taliban didn't return U.S. equipment. And so that's kind of the only thing he has really personally said about this. He's kind of remained fixated on this to the exclusion of other issues related to Afghanistan. And so, I think, again, while I personally know a lot of Afghans and a lot of Americans interested in Afghanistan who were somewhat hopeful based on Trump's campaign rhetoric and some of his selections, in particular his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, who is an Afghan war vet, that sort of thought that selection would lead to some kind of at least care and attention to Afghans who worked with the United States and have sort of been promised the ability to come to the United States. We've seen no evidence of that sort of bearing fruit.
I do wonder, I just want to ask you, in addition to that point, that is there any recognition of President Trump's role in, I suppose, what we can call the Afghanistan withdrawal disaster? Let's forget the ordinary voter for a second. President Trump is a good communicator, one can say that. But at least amongst the academic and strategic and policy communities, is there some sort of recognition of Trump's role in this? Or is there a consensus that Biden was the main person who messed up the withdrawal process?
I think anybody who's familiar with the timeline and sort of the decision tree recognize that Donald Trump planted the seed of that withdrawal. And it fell to Biden to either make the decision to break what with what is sort of long-standing precedent in which U.S. presidents continue to faithfully enact the policies and the agreements that their predecessors have signed. Now, Donald Trump will not do that. He's clearly not interested in that kind of precedent. But Biden was a politician who existed within a system, and I think he had a certain set of beliefs. Biden also wanted to exit Afghanistan. And so, I think we can go back and game out, whether decisions were made in the right way or the wrong way and what mistakes were made. But I think certainly in academic circles and sort of policy analysis, Donald Trump's role in setting out that pathway can't be discounted. And after that point, we're sort of playing games with, well, what if? And I did a little bit of that. What if Donald Trump was still president in 2020 when that withdrawal deadline came around? What would he have done? We don't know what he would have done. We can make educated guesses. But certainly on sort of the historical record, I think that's a fact. I think it does get discounted in public discourse. It's not really, I don't see it talked about a lot, but it is sort of a bit of a bugaboo for me. I think it's relevant to mention that this was Donald Trump's plan.
Right. Now, we've recently seen the giant cutbacks towards U.S. aid. I believe, is there a Supreme Court decision about that happened yesterday?
Yeah, that pertains specifically to the unfreezing of essentially money that has already been promised. So it's a contractual obligation to pay out certain amounts of money for work that has already been done. I think it applies to about $2 billion.
I see. So pay your contractors who've already done work for you, basically, not necessarily on the appropriateness or constitutionality of the U.S. aid cuts in the long run.
Yes. Yeah. So there are additional court cases that apply to U.S. aid more broadly, but that specific ruling is effectively a judge saying you agreed to pay people for this work. This work was done. You should pay them. It's a very narrow ruling, I think, is what sort of constitutional scholars would say.
Right. And the reason I want to bring this up is because I kept on hearing this phrase during the election, maybe in some of the more right-wing spaces. One of the examples of, let's say, wasteful spending or unnecessary spending that was exemplified by US aid was this policy of gender programs for women in Pakistan. I kept on hearing this phrase, gender programs for women in Pakistan. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? And I guess where this pertains to Afghanistan right now is that one of the Trump administration's first actions was obviously to significantly cut back on US aid programs around the world. And naturally, this would have a significant impact on Afghanistan, as well as Afghan refugees who have fled the Taliban regime and are living in countries like Pakistan and Iran, for instance. So could you just discuss the impacts these cutbacks might have, both on people living within Afghanistan as well as on the refugees? And on a broader level, we're sort of witnessing similar cutbacks in international development assistance in countries like the UK. How do you think might this impact the humanitarian assistance ecosystem to Afghanistan? And might there be other countries like, say, China, perhaps India, or the Gulf nations who have both the willingness and the wherewithal to fill in that gap?
Yeah, certainly. So, as to the question of, how will the cutting back of aid affect Afghans? In a word, these policies will be devastating for Afghans. As I already mentioned, the U.S., even after the withdrawal, remained the top aid donor, feeding money into sort of UN-managed efforts to provide vital and life-saving humanitarian assistance. We're talking about food, basic healthcare services. There were also sort of quieter programs, in particular supporting NGOs that continued to provide education for women and girls in secret, or train journalists to support reporting from inside the country. These organizations sort of work on very thin margins, and without that money, even if that money is ultimately restarted, some of these organizations have already ceased to exist. And so that is going to be very devastating. And I think there's also this cascade effect of halting USAID's work, again, even temporarily. For example, the United Nations Populations Fund froze all U.S.-backed programs in Afghanistan last month. VOA reported that could leave more than 9 million people cut off from health services. Things like the American University of Afghanistan, which was established with a USAID grant in 2006, and after the withdrawal had moved to Qatar, had to suspend classes for the spring semester because of uncertainties in funding. And so, there is a serious impact that is occurring because of this freeze, even again, if some of the money is restarted or if some of these programs are eventually restarted. In both the short and long term, people will die in Afghanistan, as elsewhere, as a result of sort of the dramatic cessation of aid and ultimately and that uncertainty regarding when it will be restarted and at what level. When it comes to sort of a lot of the chatter about what are wasteful foreign aid programs, I mean, it has been repeated ad nauseum that the amount of foreign aid that the U.S. spent, while it looks like a lot of money, is a mere drop in the bucket of the U.S. budget. And programs like gender programs for Pakistani women, I did try to look into this. One, this is kind of difficult to look into because a lot of the USAID website and a lot of the State Department references to these kinds of programs have been deleted, but these web pages still exist. People have archived them, and so I was able to find, for example, a page that talked about, it was on the State Department's website from the first Trump administration. That was a gender equity program in Pakistan that was administered by U.S. aid. It mirrored programs that go back as far as 2010, some probably earlier. There were similarly titled programs that were active from 2020 to 2022. A fact sheet related to USAID's gender and social inclusion efforts in Pakistan that I found laid out, a variety of programs and aims. So improving women's access to economic opportunities, increase girls' access to education, improve maternal and child health, combat gender-based violence, increase women's political and civic participation in Pakistan. And what these meant in functional terms were often training programs for female parliamentarians or teachers or farmers and activists, not just specifically focused on gender issues, but also things like countering violent extremism and sort of including women in that process, and things like voting rights. They also provided sort of health, legal, and counseling services to thousands of violence survivors. And so, again, while these amounts were not massive on the U.S. end, there's arguably a serious impact in places like Pakistan. And I think that also applies to Afghans in Pakistan. And I think, one of the things we have to think about is, I would argue that these are not wasteful programs, but that's because I believe there is value in the idea that a society cannot be truly stable, let alone prosperous and secure, when it leaves out half of the population. I also believe there's merit to the argument that helping others is not just wasteful altruism, but it does contribute to American national security. It contributes to American soft power. These things are hard to quantify, but I think the sort of international affairs literature and the political science literature on a lot of this stuff makes the case that these sorts of programs are ultimately good for the United States. I think generations of American policymakers up to this point have seen value in these kinds of programs. The United States' preeminent position is arguably a result of these kind of programs. I mean, the granddaddy of them all is the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II. But, I also have to just defend altruism for a moment. I mean, the United States, the richest country on earth, it can absolutely help others. And getting back to sort of the final question that you had there, are there other countries sort of stepping in? What does this mean for humanitarian aid more broadly? Other countries have not been particularly loud about replacing U.S. aid to Afghanistan. There are certainly programs that are funded by various European countries that are ongoing. But to my knowledge, there is a clear opportunity here. A country like China doesn't really even have to match what the U.S. was doing to reap positive benefits from being seen to step in. And given sort of China's economic interest in Afghanistan and its existing modes of engagement, it has not, quote unquote, officially recognized the Taliban, but there's a Taliban ambassador in Beijing and there's a Chinese ambassador in Kabul. So, if it's not recognition, it really looks like recognition. But that China does not necessarily care about the same issues that the United States previously cared about. So I don't, for example, see China stepping in to provide aid relevant to women's education or free media. These are just not programs that China traditionally invests in, and I just don't see them doing that. Whereas, even sort of meager food and health assistance is going to yield dividends for Beijing in reputational terms. And so there is an opportunity here. for other countries to step in. And part of that is promulgating their own sort of views on how the world should work. So this applies to China, this applies to Russia, this applies to Gulf nations that have maybe a different way of viewing the world and a different way that they think governments should be set up and operate. And they now will have the opportunity to influence that kind of development in Afghanistan through sort of just really stepping in when the United States has stepped out.
See, that's interesting because I was curious, particularly about the Gulf nations, because I think when they had come out with one of the proclamations after banning women from public universities or high school education, there were some, well, not protests per se, but there were some statements from the deputy foreign minister of the UAE, I believe, who's a woman. I always thought the Gulf nations might take up this opportunity. They have substantial reserves of funding and, they could jump at this opportunity to increase their influence on a country that borders Iran in the West. So you don't think any quarter from there might be coming in terms of aid for women?
I mean, I would hope so. I have not heard of any yet, but I think you're absolutely right that there is this opportunity there. Gulf nations are particularly a good example, given they have funds, they have access. They also have sort of our Muslim states that have women as ministers in some of them. And so, there is an opportunity there to make a positive impact. Whether they decide to do that or not, we'll have to see. I would hope so, and I do agree that there's an opportunity there for those countries to have a positive impact.
Right. And I guess moving on to the refugee issue and the refugee bans. On, I think, the very first day of his second term, President Trump issued an executive order ending nearly all refugee claims and applications to the U.S. This has consequently, amongst other impacts, led to uncertainty in the Afghan Special Immigration Visa program that helped Afghans who assisted the U.S. during its occupation to relocate to the United States, considering they faced threats to themselves and their families for assisting the United States forces. Could you maybe talk about this program and the consequences of its suspension? Where does that leave the U.S. Afghan allies now? And on a broader level, we're kind of witnessing significant scale backs in refugee acceptance programs, or at least a rhetoric about that. In Western countries, from Denmark to Germany to the United Kingdom, and the US, of course. I mean, where does that leave the Afghan refugee situation overall?
Yeah, so the SIV program that you referenced, as you said, it offers a pathway for Afghans who worked with the United States during its 20 years in Afghanistan to come to the United States. It has long been framed as essentially fulfilling a promise to those who stood and fought and were injured and died and put themselves at risk alongside Americans. The program has been repeatedly reauthorized in legislation over the years. I don't want to get too much in the weeds of how it works, but Congress essentially would include it, and I think the Defense Authorization Acts a certain number of available visas under this program. And this program actually originally operated for Afghans and Iraqis, given the U.S. involvement in Iraq in the early 2000s. And so, it provided for a certain number of visas. It was renewed every year and sort of restocked. The State Department, in conjunction with Homeland Security and the Defense Department, had a whole process to vet applicants. So essentially, Afghans would apply. There was a lot of materials and steps they had to go through in order to get approval for a visa. And then there were additional programs, some of which were funded through the UN and various other aid organizations that would provide travel grants to help Afghans get to the United States because it's not a cheap flight. And then there were resettlement assistance programs in the United States that essentially welcomed these people, helped them get set up in American life, which is quite different from living in Afghanistan. The process itself was long criticized by sort of advocates as is long and difficult. But for many, the choice between staying in Afghanistan and waiting for the Taliban to come find and possibly kill you, or to try to get out, it wasn't a question. Trying to get out was what a lot of people have tried to do. That executive order, which froze sort of all refugee claims and applications in the U.S., combined with the aid freeze, has effectively shut down the SIV program. There are certain parts of it that are still in operation, so people can still apply. But even if they get approved for a visa, they can't get funding to come to the United States. There's not really support. There's no movement for approved cases at this point. And for those with visas, the mechanisms to help them travel to the United States have also been frozen. U.S. Resettlement agencies in the U.S. have lost funding. So even those Afghans who can get to the United States have no welcoming committee anymore and effectively no assistance to find their way. The scale of this is really devastating. Activists I've talked to have say that these measures have affected at least 40,000 Afghans in Afghanistan who had completed the vetting and they were ready to travel. They had visas in hand. About 50,000 Afghans outside of Afghanistan. So we're talking largely people in Pakistan, but also in the Gulf, who were somewhere in the pipeline. They had left the country, had applied outside of Afghanistan, and were essentially waiting. There's about 15,000 Afghans in Pakistan who are waiting for flights. They had visas in hand, and around 3,000 immediate family members of active duty U.S. military personnel who are frozen somewhere in this pipeline also. There's also children who were at sort of processing centers who now no longer have food assistance. Like the list goes on. It's frankly a gross abdication of promises that were made. And from my perspective, I don't really see the Trump administration revising any of these, reversing any of these efforts or making exceptions for Afghans. Activists sort of working in this space have for the last 2 months effectively been pleading with the administration to accept Afghans from these refugee orders. And it would be as simple as the Secretary of State saying this program is accepted from this. And that just hasn't happened. In fact, yesterday, so there's an organization called Afghan EVAC, which is a coalition of organizations that have worked to really assist the U.S. government and aid groups in cooperating to sort of get Afghans through this process. They sent an email yesterday that warned that they expect new travel restrictions imminently that will make it even more difficult for Afghans, even those with absolutely valid visas, to travel to the United States. And so they were encouraging Afghans to travel as soon as possible if they had a visa, like come yesterday, because you might not be able to get in. And so, when you look at the totality of this, Afghans are being caught up in what is in part a real domestic issue in the United States, but also an issue that we've seen in a number of countries that you named, Germany, the UK, is this real pushback against really the idea of immigration, the idea of refugees. And this is stuff that's been baked into, international law for decades, but we're sort of casting aside now. And I think, the first repercussion is obviously going to be for Afghans who are either left in Pakistan and Pakistan is trying to push them out. Where are these people supposed to go? How are they supposed to live? How are they supposed to eat? The answer, it seems to be from Washington, is that's not my concern. And I think that's really devastating and will have longer term implications, both on just a human level, but also on a security level. If security is what people care about, this is the stuff that grievances are made of.
Yeah, and not to maybe focus too much on this, but one could make certain arguments for accepting refugees or not. Being in Germany, you do listen to both sides of that particular issue. I'm finding it difficult to do the same for Afghan allies who provided material support to the United States when it was in that country and are actually facing life threats because that promise is broken. I don't know, Katie, could you both sides this for me? Could you give me an alternate, what am I not seeing? And you're in DC right now, or the DC area. Could you tell me if there's any, well, not pushback, I suppose, but any movement, any subtle pressure to make an exception for this particular SIV program? I mean, I do remember some members of the administration, I'm sure Mike Waltz is one of them, who were particularly vocal about the importance of the United States Afghan allies. So is there any pushback at all?
I have been told that there are members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who are listening to activists in this space and are sort of trying to do something. I have not seen the public statements to back that up. It's a lot of it has been people don't want to. What is it? The tallest poppy gets its head chopped off. So I think people are sort of keeping their heads down right now in Washington on a lot of things, and this included. Both sizing this for me is a little bit difficult because, I think as you sort of pointed out, we could put Afghans into sort of this larger refugee category, this larger immigrant category. But we can also sort of set them aside. These are not people who are illegally immigrating to the US. A lot of these Afghans already have visas. And the process that they went through to get these visas is one of the most intense like vettings and background checks you could possibly get. They had to prove their employment. They have to do a whole bunch of stuff that is very difficult to do in order to get this visa. And frankly, it was a thing that was promised to them. This is a thing that the United States said for years: you help us, we will help you. And so I think I used the word abdication earlier. It is an abdication of those commitments. I think the sort of counter argument is these are not Americans. So that's, why should I care? This costs money. This is what I mean. Like, you can uh, rhetorically lay out both sides, but I don't think both of these sides are of equal weight, both in moral terms or in, moral terms in particular, but not even economic terms. This is not a lot of money to help people who come with skills. These are people, some of them, for example, are, you know, fighter pilots. These are people who could fly American airplanes. These are people who would be very thankful to have come to the United States, and I think would do great things for this country. These are not sort of your and I also I don't want to denigrate any sort of uneducated Afghans who also deserve a safe place to live. But if you are going to go into this hard, like, do they deserve it question, it's unequivocal. They do. This was something that was promised, and that promise has been revoked. I think, when we look at this, I am waiting for people like Walz and for members of Congress who have, for years up until this point, advocated for Afghan allies to actually say something, but also to do something. And we haven't seen that. We haven't seen those words. If the expected new travel ban comes into place, that's further confirmation that they might say those things privately, but they're not doing anything effective to see that through.
Right. And lastly, I'd like your opinion on I guess, the bigger debate on the merits of engagement with the Taliban regime versus external pressure, specifically in the context of bettering the lives of Afghan people. I mean, the context here is that unlike the Taliban 1.0 in the late 90s, this new regime has actually seen countries outside its traditional supporters, UAE, Pakistan. You've seen countries like China and India now make cautious outreach and moves towards engagement, if not de facto, de jure recognition, that is. So maybe just on that level of, in order to secure better access to humanitarian assistance and resources for the Afghan people, do you think that integrating the Taliban regime in some aspects into the global system in the long run might secure a better deal for the Afghan people, especially as we're seeing maybe the appetite for pressure and sanctions or even interest in Afghanistan seems to be going down since 2021? What's your take on this?
Yeah, so this is the like $1 million question. It's a very tricky question. There are certainly those who are vehemently opposed to any and all engagement with the Taliban. They argue that this is not only an illegitimate government, it's a terrorist organization. Others take what they would call a pragmatic approach. This is the favored terminology in Central Asia, for example, is we're being pragmatic, and they endorse engaging the Taliban under this idea and this precept that engagement can draw the Taliban into the international community and therefore may moderate some of its worst impulses. I'll be honest with you, I don't know what the right answer is. My instinct is that it's probably somewhere in the middle, a mix of engagement and isolation, your carrots and your sticks. Afghans themselves have varying opinions on this, and honestly, I think it's their opinions that ought to have the greatest weight, because they ultimately have to live with the repercussions of this. What I do want to say is that when we say things like secure a better future for Afghan people, I think we also have to specify which Afghan people we're talking about. It's pretty clear to me that a Taliban government in Afghanistan, whether internationally recognized or not, at this juncture is going to be a religious patriarchal autocracy, which has little space for women to wield influence, let alone participate in politics or society. It has no tolerance for the LGBTQ community and really only opportunistic tolerance for sort of the diversity entity that is Islam. And we see shades of this kind of government in the Gulf. You have your Saudi Arabias, your Irans, your Jordans, which have a variety of varying degrees of international relations. But some of them are extremely conservative and pretty repressive themselves. And so there's a variety of models that are internationally accepted, but maybe not the best for all people in those countries. I am also not convinced that engagement always leads to change. I think it may lead to change with sort of deliberate and coordinated policies, but I think coordination on Afghanistan is going to be increasingly difficult. I think there are some sort of examples maybe worth looking at. And I'm not an expert in this particular area, but, I think Afghans and international leaders should look at the example of apartheid South Africa. Many Afghan activists have termed the Taliban's policies with regard to women as a gender apartheid. And I think that's a suitable term to describe the reality. For those that are less familiar, from 1948 to 1994, South Africa was governed by a system of racial segregation, which is known as apartheid. It wasn't really challenged much internationally until the 1960s, so 1948 until the 1960s. And it wasn't until the late 1980s that global powers began enforcing sanctions on South Africa because the state's policies regarding race, which were sort of par for the course in maybe 1948. They were increasingly out of step with evolving global norms. I would hope that change does not take that long to come to Afghanistan. But I think that example both sort of proves this idea that there is value in engagement, but there is also value in punishment and disengagement. Enforcing change is not easy or simple. I think, arguably the international community needs to take a unified approach to Afghanistan. But given really the sort of convulsive reorientation of the United States' geopolitical outlook and its own sort of domestic setting aside for concern for things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, that prospect seems increasingly dim. And once again, I think a lot of this is a discussion that Afghans need to have a voice in because it's their country. Afghanistan's neighbors, I also want to point out, have pursued policies that are in their own interest, which is engagement. If we look at Central Asia, it's certainly the case because Afghanistan stands between these countries and global trade networks. And so I think when you also take a look at India's engagement and China's engagement, a lot of that is based on their own interests, not necessarily the interests of Afghans. So, that's a long way of saying I don't know what the right answer is, whether it's engagement or external pressure. I do honestly think it's a bit of both. And I think that leaves everyone very unsatisfied and it feels like hedging, but there is sort of space for this. I think we also have to not discount that Afghanistan and the people within Afghanistan and even just within the Taliban and the various factions are also sort of, actors in this play. And so, if there's factionalism in Afghanistan between different parts of the Taliban, how does that impact engagement elsewhere? Is a serious question, is I think a little bit broader than this debate. But, I think you can look at history and you can cherry pick examples that proves that engagement is the way to go. And you can also find examples that say that engagement is not the way to go. And so, I think we won't get to know until after it's happened what the right path would have been. But I think there's merits to kind of both ends of that argument.
Fair enough. And I think the impact on women is a particularly pertinent question right now, as International Women's Day is coming up. And our next guest is going to talk more in detail about this specific impact on women and women's rights in the region. But yeah, thank you, Katie, for shedding some light on this, frankly, very dismal situation.
Thank you so much for having me and for looking into this important topic in the detail I think it deserves.
So joining us today is Dr. Isabelle Lassee. Isabelle is the Deputy Director for Research at the Amnesty International South Asia Regional Office. She holds a doctorate in international law from the University of Paris, Panthéon-Assas University, and has worked on human rights in South Asia for the past 15 years, with a specific focus on international humanitarian law, fact-finding, and transitional justice. Prior to joining Amnesty International, she was the co-founder and former head of programs of the South Asian Center for Legal Studies, a think tank based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. So, Isabelle, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Fantastic. So, Isabel, to begin with, I'm so glad to have you on today to sort of narrow the focus of the broader Afghanistan imbroglio and narrow the focus on how it impacts women specifically. So, to start with, could you give us an overview of the overall regression of women's rights in Afghanistan since 2021? How has the systemic erasure of women's rights taken place since the Taliban takeover, despite guarantees by many of the participants in the Doha peace process? And maybe to zoom in on the systemic aspect of this, what are the policies and enforcement methods used to carry out many of these decrees? And what happens to women who choose to defy these measures?
What we see happening in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over in 2021 is a clear violation of commitments that were made by the Doha participants that women would continue enjoying access to education, employment, and participation in public service. And what we are seeing is not just a rollback on progress, it is an outright assault on women's rights. And the Taliban have left no stone unturned to silence and to render Afghan women and girls invisible and to strip them of their agency. Since their takeover, the Taliban have issued more than 70 edicts targeting women and girls. And these are not just isolated restrictions. They are calculated measures to remove women from public life entirely. And these prohibitions impact on all aspects of everyday life. Afghan women are forbidden to move freely without a mahram, that is a male guardian. They are prohibited from accessing public spaces, gyms, parks, and they are policed in every aspect of their lives. Women are now banned from education beyond primary school, from speaking in public, and from most forms of employment. The most recent directive even forbids them from pursuing medical education, like nursing and midwifery. This not only further curtail access to essential work opportunities for these women, it also endangers healthcare for women across the country. And it is a so-called Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and Prevention of Vice that is in charge of enforcing these restrictions. And the consequences for those who dare to resist are extremely severe. These include various forms of harassment, of course, arbitrary arrest, enforced appearances, and torture. In addition to this, the Taliban have dismantled critical institutions that once supported women. For example, safe houses for survivors of domestic violence have been shut down. Legal aid offices no longer function. The Afghan Ministry of Women Affairs and its provincial offices have been dismantled. And even the Independent Human Rights Commission has been dissolved. So basically, women are left with no avenue for protection and for justice. And they are more vulnerable than ever. And the impact is devastating. Afghan women and girls are forced to live as second-class citizens. They're silenced. They are excluded from all aspects of society. And we also see that child marriage and gender-based violence is on the rise. Countless families are plunged into financial hardship because of the ban on women's employment. And these violations are not just cruel, they are systematic, they are institutionalized, and they are undoing decades of progress and shattering lives.
One of the things about Afghanistan I hope people appreciate is that it is not a homogenous country, and nor is the ruling Taliban regime a homogenous entity. There have been divergences in the way women's rights are approached, in the freedoms and the agency that women gained during the US occupation of Afghanistan, during the US regime. And I wonder if you could comment about, are there divergences today in Afghanistan between the way different factions of the government, or let's say in different regions, let's say urban and rural, or Pashtun and non-Pashtun areas, are there differences in the way these laws against women are implemented, de facto, at least, if not de jure? Maybe you could comment on these different approaches towards women's rights in different parts of Afghanistan. And I just wonder if it's not in the scope of Amnesty International to comment too much about political ongoings, but I do wonder whether, if you talk about the factions or the power struggles of the Afghan government, if one faction triumphs over the other, or if some people come to power over the other, whether that might make a change in the long-term trajectory of women's rights in Afghanistan?
Yes, there have been reports in the media of growing tensions within the Taliban regime, particularly between the Haqqani network and the faction that is aligned with the Doha Agreement. But of course, the Taliban were never a unified group, and the current divisions, which are mostly talked about in the media, are part of the Taliban political identity. So internationally, the Taliban supreme leader who sits in Kandahar with his inner circle is mostly viewed as a hardliner resistant to change. And in contrast, the Haqqani network is perceived to have a more pragmatic approach, specifically when it comes to engagement with the international community. But it is unclear how these divisions run and whether they offer a prospect for an improvement of the human rights situation. In fact, it is difficult to believe that any of these groups would offer a change to the current policies of systematic repression of women's rights. What we see on the other end is that violations of women's and girls' rights in Afghanistan are implemented across the country, and they affect the majority of women and girls in every aspect of their lives. They are enforced through violent acts such as torture, arbitrary arrest and detention, and enforced disappearances. And we believe that these amount to the crimes against humanity of gender persecution because they are both widespread and systematic, and they are carried out in pursuance of Taliban's policy. It is this very crime that was looked at by the International Criminal Court and that led to the prosecutor's request for an arrest warrant against the Taliban leaders. And the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan also called for accountability for the crime against humanity of gender persecution and asked that gender apartheid be made a crime under international law. This call was fronted by Afghan women. It is also supported by Amnesty International. And we believe that the recognition under international law of the crime of gender apartheid would be essential to strengthen efforts to combat institutional regimes of systematic oppression that are imposed on the ground of gender.
Right. And I think that the conundrum when it comes to the plight of Afghan women isn't just limited to the borders of Afghanistan, is it? Because about 2.6 million Afghans right now are external refugees, with 2.2 million in Pakistan and Iran alone. We've seen that Pakistan has announced its illegal foreigners, quote unquote, repatriation plan in October 2023, which is still ongoing in different phases and could entail the deportation of up to 2 million refugees back to Afghanistan. Could you talk about the regional dynamics of the Afghan refugee crisis and discuss Pakistan's refugee deportation plans in particular and what are the reasons behind it? How far advanced is it in its implementation? I believe there was a phase 1 which has been completed, but there's a phase 2 and 3 which are going to be implemented soon or already in progress. So it would be great if you could talk about that. And is there any pushback either from within the refugee community or from local and foreign stakeholders against this plan?
Yes. The illegal foreign repatriation plan was announced in October 2023, and it has had a devastating impact on millions of Afghan refugees. So what is this plan? It is a plan for repatriation and deportation that was meant, as you said, to be implemented in 3 phases. So the first phase imposed a 30-day deadline for undocumented Afghan refugees to leave Pakistan or face deportation. This deadline was not only unrealistic, it also created immense fear among refugees, with over 1.4 million people potentially affected. And Amnesty International responded immediately and documented cases of arbitrary arrest, detention, and eviction of refugees, both before and after the deadline. The second phase of the plan focuses on Afghan citizens holding Afghan citizens' cards. And the third phase targets those with proof of registration cards that are issued by the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR. And since the plan has been operationalized, the numbers are staggering. According to UNHCR, over 734,000 Afghan refugees have left Pakistan and have returned to Afghanistan. But of course, many of these returns are far from voluntary. And the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, has reported that over 42,000 Afghan refugees have faced arrests and detention inside Pakistan since 2023. So, where are we at and what are the latest developments? In July last year, the Pakistani government announced a 1-year extension for the validity of proof of registration cards. But unfortunately, this relief was very short-lived. And in January, a new executive order targeted Afghan refugees in Islamabad and Rawalpindi. And with that, there was a fresh wave of raids, arrests, and deportations. And in January alone, at least 986 Afghans were deported, and over 18,000 returned to Afghanistan. So the government has set a March 31st deadline for Afghan refugees to evacuate these areas, regardless of their documentation status. So as a result, this policy has even affected refugees that were going to embassies and to the UNHCR or the IOM offices for documentation and immigration processes. So why is this happening? The reasons are quite complex. There are security concerns, which are a major factor. As you know, there are tensions between Pakistan and the Taliban around security issues. And in particular, Pakistan accuses the Taliban authorities of supporting the TTP, which is a militant group that is responsible for terrorist attacks in Pakistan. And when tensions escalate between the two countries, refugees are the first to pay the price. There are also economic factors at play. The Pakistani government has presented refugees as a foreign burden amidst economic challenges. And this is despite the significant contributions that Afghan refugees have made to Pakistan's economy. And of course, this rhetoric has fueled xenophobia and deepened social divisions. Internal politics are also a factor. And following the PTI protests last year, the Pakistani government claimed that Afghan nationals were involved in violent demonstrations, and this led to stricter policies. In December, the government announced that Afghan nationals would not be allowed to stay in Islamabad without obtaining a no objection certificate. But despite these challenges, there has been a significant pushback. And Pakistani civil society organizations like the Joint Action Committee for Refugees have been advocating against these measures. And they provide legal aid, they lobby the government, they work with international organizations like the UNHCR and the IOM to extend refugee registrations. The Human Rights Commissioner of Pakistan has also called for an end to the harassment and arbitrary arrests of Afghan refugees. But the international community's response has been more inconsistent. While Western governments lobby Pakistan to extend refugee stays, they have failed to accelerate their own immigration processes. And because of that, Afghan refugees were left stranded in Pakistan. In January, as you know, the Trump administration suspended its U.S. refugee admission program. And following this, Pakistan's foreign ministry announced that Afghan refugees were not accepted for resettlement by the United States would be treated as illegal immigrants and deported. So really, as a global community, we must do more to protect Afghan refugees, hold government accountable, and ensure that no one is forced to return to a life of danger and oppression.
Right. And in fact, we just spoke to our deputy editor, Catherine Putz, who's a Central Asia regional expert, about the suspension of not just the U.S. refugee programs, but a general backsliding in the West in terms of refugee acceptance. I mean, I'm based in Germany, and I see that there's a considerable backlash towards acceptance of refugees there as well. So it's very problematic, I think, for many of the people stranded, who have nowhere else to go but back into an extraordinarily oppressive regime. But I don't want to make this just about. Sometimes I think stories about refugees have the possibility of robbing agency from the people who are affected. And, despite many, many attempts to both systemically and, de facto erase Afghan women from public life within and outside the country, many women inside the country as well as abroad are resisting in a number of different ways, even though they are facing violent pushback sometimes for their efforts. Isabelle, you've worked with and spoken to many of these women. Could you highlight the resistance efforts by Afghan women and their allies and what challenges they face? And maybe touch upon how effective have these efforts been in facilitating any action at all to limit the backsliding of women's rights in Afghanistan?
So at first, when the Taliban took over, women started protesting with a very clear message around work, freedom, and employment. And of course, as you imagine, these protests were not welcomed by the Taliban. And rapidly, the Ministry of Interior announced a new decree that required Taliban's permission for protests. Initially, these restrictions led to an increase in protests by women in Kabul and in the northern provinces. But, the women protesters faced a lot of intimidation and repression. They were attacked, insulted, threatened, beaten, arbitrarily arrested, some of them along with their children and male family members. And Amnesty International issued urgent actions for their release. Later, we also tried to assist with relief support for exile and lobbied through amnesty sections for resettlement. But after some time, women feared repression, so the public protesting stopped. But they continued to protest in their homes through slogans, joint letters, artwork. So within Afghanistan, activism is continuing, and women activists find avenues to participate in online meetings and discussions, although, of course, they take precautions. So, for example, they don't come on cameras and organizers don't expose their whereabouts. For women in exile, after a period that was necessary for them to resettle and to find their way in a new country, they also started organizing. And now there are networks and collectives across countries of Afghan women activists. They organize protests and events. They carry out advocacy at the Security Council, at the Human Rights Council, or with governments. And those who still have their networks within the country make sure that voices from within are heard in their campaigning and advocacy. Afghan women activists are calling for concrete measures to hold the Taliban accountable. And this call to end impunity has played a major role in recent developments, including before the International Criminal Court, when the ICC prosecutor made an application for arrest warrants against Taliban leaders for the crime against humanity of gender persecution. Another major achievement is the September 2024 announcement by the governments of Australia, Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands that they will initiate legal proceedings for violations of the UN Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women by the Taliban. And this process would ultimately lead to a case before the International Court of Justice against the state of Afghanistan. And this initiative has been supported by another 20 countries. And this initiative has been supported by another 20 countries and by many women and human rights defenders from Afghanistan. In addition, Afghan women are also campaigning for the recognition of gender apartheid in international law. And this call is also supported by Amnesty International. And we will continue to remain engaged with Afghan's human rights community, including women activists and protesters, both in Afghanistan and in exile. What we see is that Afghan women demonstrate extraordinary courage, and they risk everything to demand justice, to speak out, and to fight for their rights. And their resilience will really inspire all of us to take action to hold the Taliban regime to account.
Absolutely. And finally, I want to touch upon the question of, I guess a broader debate about the efficacy of international pressure or the impetus to engage with the Taliban regime. And I want to use a specific example because, Isabelle, you've lived in South Asia. You know how cricket here is such a massive thing. And I want to talk about the Afghan women's cricket team as an example. And recently we just finished the Champions Trophy. Afghanistan has, despite everything they've been through, the Afghan men's team has emerged as one of the best in the world, frankly. But at the same time, the Taliban regime does not allow, obviously, the Afghan women's team to compete or even exist. This has led to some debate about whether or not one should ban the Afghan men's team from international competitions as a way to pressure the Taliban to letting a women's team play. Now, this might seem a trite example, but I think it illustrates a problem that we're facing right now because on the one hand, by introducing, say, sanctions or pressure or bans on the regime, it could pressure the regime in some ways, but it could also just lead to the regime not caring and, frankly, just affecting the Afghan people. So maybe you could use that example to maybe touch upon the point of international pressure versus engagement. what do you think might be a better strategy or a better balance in the long run if we were to look at it through the lens of bettering the lives of Afghan women specifically? How might we thread this line to ensure the best practicable outcome in the long run, if not the ideal solution, given the current international environment towards Afghanistan and towards refugees in general?
Yeah. On a specific issue of men's cricket team, there are calls um, for the men's cricket team to be banned from international competitions. Amnesty International has not taken a position because we are also mindful of the ramifications for men's players and their family of such a boycott. And as an organization, we are focusing more on the need for inclusion. And in this respect, we would like to see the International Cricket Council support the Afghan women cricket team in exile, because really the failure to do so enables the ongoing discrimination and exclusion of Afghan women from international competitions. We would also very much like to see the ICC use its considerable leverage to demand that women and girls' rights to play sport in Afghanistan is restored. Because as you know, under the Taliban, women and girls are banned from playing sport at any level and in any circumstance. But beyond cricket, you're right. This raises a question of the merits of international pressure versus engagement. The Taliban now have much more de facto diplomatic relations and engagement regionally and internationally than in the 1990s, when they were first controlling most part of the country. And just as an example, based on recent media reports, India has accepted the Taliban's introduction of new members to the Afghan consulate in Mumbai. And that was a precedent that was set by Turkey, Iran, China, and a few others. Beyond this, internationally, there seems to be a lack of consensus towards an effective strategy that would collectively address the ongoing human rights issues and recognize that Afghan women must participate in all discussions about the future of their country. And just as an example, in June, July last year, for the UN-convened meeting on Afghanistan in Qatar, Afghan women were not invited to partake in the conversations. And the meeting agenda did not include items on human rights or women's rights. And we believe that this decision by the UN essentially handed the Taliban an enormous victory with no tangible benefits. Last year, we held consultations with more than 150 stakeholders, and Afghan women we spoke to have told us that while the international community has issued multiple statements, they have ignored the plea of women human rights defenders and, in fact, have failed the people of Afghanistan. So it is crucial that the international community adopts a clear and united sense that women and girls' rights in Afghanistan are not non-negotiable and start rallying behind the 2023 UN Security Council resolution, which called for the swift reversal of Taliban's draconian measures against women and girls. But unfortunately, the lack of a unified position internationally on how to deal with the ongoing situation in the country has provided additional impunity for the Taliban. And it is this very culture of impunity that enables the Taliban's ongoing grave human rights violations. And that really needs to be addressed urgently. Sadly, in a world that's, battling multiple conflicts, in particular in Ukraine and Gaza, Afghanistan risks becoming a forgotten crisis. And that's why the international community cannot continue to take a business as usual approach vis-a-vis the human rights situation in Afghanistan. And the Taliban must be held accountable for crimes under international law. And that could be done through the application of universal jurisdiction, prosecutions before the International Criminal Court. Additionally, Amnesty International is also calling for the UN Human Rights Council to establish an independent international accountability mechanism that would, collect and preserve evidence for future prosecutions.
Thank you, Isabel. And, we have listeners across the world, both in South Asia as well as in Western countries. How might our average listener be able to support your efforts and maybe contribute to enhancing their voices and maybe providing some sort of support to Afghan women?
I think as an individual, it's there are avenues in which we can act. There are campaigns that are launched by Amnesty International on rights issues and including on the Afghan situation. So joining these campaigns, you writing letters to demand accountability to various governments, your government, for example, to support international mechanisms on accountability, to take a firmer stand with respect to the Taliban regimes. All those are avenues through which individuals can act in their everyday life to further the protection of these essential rights that are currently being violated in Afghanistan.
Dr. Isabelle Lassee, thank you so much again for joining the podcast and helping bring back focus on this largely ignored issue, I feel, and helping people find out more about what Afghan women are going through.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about Afghan women and their fight for justice.